Sebastian, welcome to 12 Geniuses.
Thank you, Don. I'm so psyched to be on your show. I started listening to prior episodes, and I already love it. I'm an instant fan.
Tell your friends.
I will.
I appreciate that.
And by the way, your ratings are amazing.
Well.
I think you've got like a perfect rating. So this is really high pressure for me today.
Well, we'll talk about pressure. We'll talk about stress. I think those are good things. I think you're going to convince us that those are positive things to have in our life. Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I work in money management, 25 years. You could define it as a high pressure job. I oversee over 500 billion in assets under management. And a few years ago, I became super interested in positive psychology and sports psychology, and that has led to the publication of my book, The Psychology of Leadership. So here we are.
Why did you write that book?
I was stressed at the time. And you know what? I was stressing about stressing. So I was adding another layer to it. And I ended up talking to a sports psychologist where I live here in Maryland. And we sit down, and he decides to tell me the story of his best match ever. So it turns out this sports psychologist, his name is Dr. Daniel Zimmett, holds 40 national titles in the sport of handball. Now, handball is kind of like squash, but you whack the ball with your hands, if you know which sport I'm talking about. And so Zimmett happens to have 40 national titles in that sport, but he's also a sports psychologist. So he's an interesting person who's mastered the mindset as an athlete, and then in his practice coaching other athletes, NFL, pro baseball players, Olympic athletes. So we sit down, and he starts telling me the story about this match. But the match took place 10 years prior. And it's so strange because he remembers everything about the match, every point. He's describing, point 8, the ball hit that wall. And there's so much passion. He's describing how at some point he's on his knees and does an extreme shot to get the ball, makes the point. And then, Don, it's an absolute letdown because he goes, I lost the next 2 points. And I go, wait. You lost that match? And he goes, yes. And to him, he starts explaining the mindset. It was completely irrelevant at the point whether he won or lost the match. He was playing a much stronger opponent. And that day on the court, he realized he had made huge progress in his game, and he was now able to play at a higher level. So he was using this to explain the mindset in sports psychology. Roger Federer famously told students recently, no matter what game you play in life, you're going to lose. Because if you think about it, Roger Federer actually only won 54% of the points he ever played, even though he won 80% of the matches. And it's just such a beautiful description of the sports psychology mindset, where he goes, the best in the world are not the best in the world because they don't lose. They're the best in the world because they know they're going to lose again and again, and they've learned how to deal with it. And it's not about winning. Sports psychology is about losing. I found that fascinating. And what you learn from the losses. And if you transfer that to my day job in money management, look, no one has a crystal ball, and we will get investment decisions wrong. But if we have that small edge that we apply consistently over time, then we can deliver wonderful outcomes, wonderful returns for our investors. So there's a direct analogy with money management. There's a direct analogy with just business in general, and the fact that you're going to make decisions that are going to be wrong. And that was the spark. That was the spark for me to start reading. I'm a nerd. I'm a research nerd in finance and economics. So I started reading now scientific literature in sports psychology and in positive psychology, ultimately in personality psychology, which is super interesting as well. And that's why I wrote the book. Long story short, it was just this spark that occurred when I realized that there's so much research around resilience, around losing, around accepting losses, around the mindset, that is not known or applied in the business world. So that became sort of my mission.
What happens when somebody makes a bad choice or when there's a loss? How do you handle that as a leader? How do you want your other leaders within the organization to handle that?
So here's a number one takeaway for me on the relationship between the two, the world of sports, the world of investing in business. You have to learn in our world to separate luck from skill. And there's great work that's been published by Annie Duke on this. I'm a huge fan of hers. She's a great author. She was a pro poker player and became an expert at decision making under uncertainty, which is what we do when we're investing. So separating luck from skill. If you think about it, athletes control their process, they control their preparation, but on the day of, they can't control the weather, they can't control what their opponents are going to do. There are all sorts of dimensions, how they're going to feel that day. So many dimensions they can't control. And they all too, when they lose, might have played their best. So they too have to separate luck from skill. There's a huge random component to sports. There's a huge random component to investing. So a simple example I like to use, Don, of just to illustrate the concept is, suppose that we go out to dinner, the two of us. Podcast was such a positive experience. We decide, let's go continue the conversation over dinner. And we have so much good wine that it's not a good idea to drive. But suppose that actually I decide to drive home nonetheless after a bottle of wine. That, is a bad decision. But if I make it home safely, it's a good outcome.
Still a bad decision.
Still a bad
Yeah,
decision,
that's right.
right?
Yeah.
And so in investing, people will put all their money into a crypto coin, right? A meme coin, and they might triple their money in 2 months and feel like it was a really good decision, but it really was luck. And it's not repeatable over time and it's incredibly risky. And one day they'll probably lose all their money.
Mhm.
And then the opposite is true as well, right? I might decide to get an Uber, but the Uber crashes. Bad outcome. Bad outcome. But I can't obsess over my bad and think I made a bad decision because it wasn't a bad decision.
That's right.
So that happens all the time in business and in particular in investing. You followed your process, you made the right decision, but Russia invaded Ukraine. And you you had no way of knowing what would happen to oil prices. Right, so separating luck from skill applies to both worlds. To me, it might be the number one takeaway of how to think about the mindset beyond what we just talked about, which is learning from your losses. I think separating luck from skill is one way to learn from your losses. Look back. Did I prepare well? Did I make the right decision, even though the randomness in the outcome didn't come my way?
So let's say somebody has on your team a really good outcome, but their process was flawed. How would you address that?
You have to discuss the process itself and separate the outcome from the process. Those discussions aren't easy to have. People, it's human nature, if you're lucky, to think that you made really good decisions. And it's human nature, if you're not lucky, to think that you did everything right. So constantly you have to be direct and honest and build trusting relationships when you're all involved. Sometimes it's an investment committee, sometimes it's two people discussing investment outcomes or other business outcomes. When you're all able to discuss the process itself, you kind of have to build intrinsic motivation to perfect your process. There's another thing from sports psychology. It differentiates between ego motivation and process motivation. And if you're motivated by improving your swing at golf more than by the actual score on the board, then you're in a good place long term. You're in a good mental place. And as a player, probably have more longevity and success. So you have to have these discussions no matter what the outcome is. As a mentor of mine told me one day early in my career, you will learn, Sebastian, he said, there are only two types of investors: those who are talented and those who are unlucky. And that was an introduction to this idea of human nature. If we get it wrong, we weren't lucky. If we get it right, we were talented.
What are the most important psychological principles that distinguish great leaders from good ones?
Okay, I love that question, Don, because you're saying great versus good. Let me, for you, describe what most people would think are the qualities of a great leader, but really it's more basic in being a good leader. So imagine a great leader in popular culture. Well, she's very convincing and a very strong communicator, inspiring others, great speeches. Certainly is part of it. She's decisive, makes quick decisions. She never quits. You know, we talk a lot about resilience, don't quit in the face of adversity. And she's calm under pressure. She doesn't experience stress, right? There's always a calm demeanor around in her behavior. Well, it turns out I can argue in the psychology of leadership that that's all fine and good, but it's actually the exact opposite that will take you to the absolute next level. And here's the counterintuitive part. This is backed by research. I talk about my own experience. If you want to get to the next step as a leader, it's more likely than not that it's not about how well you communicate and your inspiring speeches. It's the opposite. Are you a good listener? I had this during the pandemic. I had a little sticker on my computer that says, listen more, talk less. In my own journey, it's been more about developing my listening skills, like a leadership superpower that's completely underrated. And then about this idea of being decisive and making quick decisions. The hardest part in business is actually to exercise strategic patience when you have time to make a decision. Some of the best leaders I've worked with would often ask, how much time do we have to make that decision? How much time do we have to hire that person to look at that strategic acquisition? And if they had more time, they would actually keep the optionality. Strategic patience, greatly underrated, counterintuitive. This idea of never quitting. The toughest thing to do in high performing leadership is knowing what to quit and when to quit. Going back to Annie Duke as well, she's written about that as well. So, see how it's actually the reverse. And this idea of not experiencing stress, this is directly from sports psychology and from the research. Um, Optimal performance in sports for sure, and I believe in life, does not occur at a stress level of 0. A little bit of stress and activation will improve your performance up to a point, after which we know stress can be really bad. It can kill you basically over a long run. But this idea that there's a curve and that activation, increasing stress can increase your performance is actually key because you know what? If you want to go from good to a great leadership, you're going to experience stress. Just like athletes, they experience stress. Dr. Simon told me like top athletes are all high in neuroticism.
Hmm,
This is stressful,
hmm.
but learning to harness it, reframe it, and turn it into higher performance is part of it. So there you go. People say communicate well, be decisive, never quit, be resilient. I'm saying if you want to go great, if you want to take it to the next level, do the opposite. Listen more, learn strategic patience, know when to quit because it's hard, and embrace stress.
Let's start with stress because I agree. And I've heard you talk about an archer versus a power lifter, right? There's a lot of stress. And one activity is very mental, one's physical, and the type of stress. One is fine motor skills, the other's gross motor skills. But I've also heard you talk about the 100 meters, right? Where you're trying to
Yep.
activate. But I find that event to be really interesting because at the very beginning of the race, you have to have an incredible amount of control over the stress to start well. So maybe you could talk about those examples and how to manage those uh, that type of stress. And then I also want to talk about surgery and I want to talk about fighter pilots as well, because I think those are interesting types of roles where they have very high levels of stress?
Well done. First of all, thank you. You've clearly done your homework
I
here.
did a little bit of
Uh,
research, yeah.
and look, it's called a Yerkes-Dodson's curve, if people wanna look it up. It's got about 80 years of research behind it. The Yerkes-Dodson's curve, Yerkes Dodson, shows that performance for athletes increases with activation and stress up to an optimal performance point, after which performance decreases, you choke. Now, what's really interesting, which you're raising, is the curves look different for different tasks. They also look different for different people. You and I have different Yerkes-Dodson's curves. So when you start with this mental model and you look at different tasks, you quickly realize, as you suggest, that some tasks require higher activation levels. Uh, Simple tasks, the 100-meter dash, the power lifter. Other tasks, you'll obtain optimal performance at a lower stress level, not zero, but at a lower stress level. Archery, taking a math test, surgery. So when you manage a team in an organization, can you think of the organization's Yerkes-Dodson's curve and calibrating your goals and measures of success to look for that optimal point, not make the goals too easy, not make the goals too hard. So it applies to calibrating pressure, if you will, inside an organization and realizing that the optimal is not zero, because anyway, zero pressure, zero stress, personally or organizationally, is impossible. So you have task specific Yerkes-Dodson curves, and understanding those is fascinating. Notice, Don, how I'm playing a little loose with the language because I'm substituting stress with activation. Sports psychologists will take issue with this.
Hmm.
It's very important for them, or in the literature, it's also called arousal. So they'll reframe stress as something that kind of feels the same, biologically is the same, but has a different impact and is essentially reframed. So that is also part of it. That is a caveat. Now, what you also mentioned is the curves are people specific. Some people have very high performance at very low stress level. Their entire curve looks in a different place in the graph. And so then the question is, how do they get there? Right. In the book, I like to use the example of Neil Armstrong because famously he had a really interesting Yerkes-Dodson's curve. He performed really well at really low stress level. Apparently, the mission went completely wrong. This is a famous story. They lost connection. They didn't have communication. The computer didn't work. The module went off course. They ran out of fuel. Armstrong took manual control, landed the thing in the place it wasn't supposed to land, and then the rest is history. He famously came out and said, "One small step for a man, one giant leap for humanity." If you think about this moment, you get goosebumps, right? What most people don't realize is that as an astronaut, he was hooked to a heart rate monitor. And Don, do you know, if you've heard me say it, do you know what the heart rate was for most of the mission?
I do. 75 beats per minute. It's unbelievable.
75 beat. You really did your homework. 75 beats per minute. That is
Mine is
for
going a lot faster than that right now.
yeah, yeah. We're probably both at that higher than like for a lot of people, 75 is resting. And so Neil Armstrong had a lot of repetition. So he had a lot of experience in high pressure situations where he developed stress resilience skills. And then in the moment, there's also a lot of research about how to, in the moment, address stressful situations. I used to think breathing exercises were kind of trite advice. But when you start using them and trying them in very high pressure situation, you realize the effect they have and they actually work. So there are all these different ways you can improve your Yerkes-Dodson curve.
Can I make a comment on the breathing? Because I had a fighter pilot on the show, Major General Kenneth Ekman. It's a great episode if you go back and listen to it. He is now a general serving in Germany, but with a command in Africa. And he has about 3,000 flight hours, 600 in combat. And he says that when he has a stressful mission, he'll go back and listen to his breathing on the mission. And he'll look to see, oh, is the breathing irregular? Was it elevated? Was it faster than normal? So he's very in tune to breathing. And he reminded me, well, not that I knew, but he said, a mission is not stressful unless you're getting shot at. So his idea of what's stressful is completely different than mine or yours or than the general public. And the other one who has been on the show is Dr. Michael Mattis, who is a world-class surgeon. And he's become a friend of mine. He's in Minneapolis here and we've become friendly. And he said that he has this ability to detach that not all of us do. So he separates, like you were talking earlier, he separates the outcome from the process, focuses just on the process, is able to detach that this is somebody's father or mother or brother or son, and he just focuses on what his training has taught him to do over and over. And then and he's a very emotional guy. He's a hugger and he's, great father, but in that moment, he's able to detach in a way that I don't think a lot of us have learned to do.
You know what that makes me think of is the state of flow, around which there's a lot of research in positive and sports psychology as well. He's probably able to get in flow where the challenge he's addressing is a really good fit for his skill level, so that he's fully engaged because he needs to be fully engaged. And it's not too easy so that he gets distracted. It's not too hard so that he gets discouraged and he's just in the sweet spot zone of flow. That just sounds like you're describing flow here, which is also part of operating optimally on those stress curves. Look, my view is I started this journey, the research, by stressing about stressing. I kept telling myself, I've been doing this for 25 years. Why do I experience this stress? And then getting into sports psychology and realizing that I don't need these two layers of stress. One is enough. And then embracing it as part of performance fuel. But yeah, the state of flow is a big part of the research in positive psychology, a big part of what I write about in the psychology of leadership. I have a couple chapters on it. And it's a huge, I think, underestimated tool, mental model for business in general. How do you get your organization in flow? And what a lot of people don't realize is flow is also a social concept. It's also a team concept. And I think you've had at least three sports psychologists on your show before, and sports psychologists care a lot about team performance as well. And I just listened to a prior episode where we were talking about team building as well and getting the right pieces together. Well, flow can be a team experience. If you go back to the original research with Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, where he started writing about it, in there he says conversation can be a source of flow. So right now, Don, we're having a conversation. We're fully engaged. And in meetings, I see it in business. When people start debating an idea, tough problem to solve, I'm looking around the room and I think the team is in flow right now. The intellect is fully engaged, it's challenging, and we're in a team state of flow, which is a really good place to be. So, how do you build the conditions in your business world or in your sports organization to generate team level flow?
How can business leaders apply positive psychology to create more resilient teams, especially in high pressure corporate environments?
I go back to the basics of positive psychology with Martin Seligman coming up with the acronym PERMA. I don't like acronyms because we use them too much in business. I like PERMA. I think it's a good one. So P stands for positive emotion. IRMA is where positive psychology comes in, and it describes how people thrive in the long run. E stands for engagement. We were just talking about the state of flow, for example. R stands for relationship. The Harvard study famously shows that the number one factor of long term happiness is the quality of relationships in your life. M stands for meaning. That's become popular in business. People talk about your why, but there's so much more to do to make it tangible and practical. And A stands for long term accomplishment. The IRMA is what really matters. And my mission with the psychology of leadership, I take one chapter per letter to make it practical in terms of setting goals in a business, in terms of handling feedback, which is a huge part of performance management now in the business world, and how that relates to the research on positive relationships. And then I go into meaning and long term accomplishment as well. But there's a lot that hasn't been applied yet, at least directly in business.
We're moving into this AI centric workplace. We're likely there, but it's going to be a bigger part of our lives. And my hypothesis is that if we're going to get anything done or be valuable in the workplace, we need to establish strong relationships and be able to establish trust. Do you agree with that? And do you have any advice for building these types of relationships?
Going back to positive psychology, the Harvard study that I mentioned earlier is fascinating, right? They have 80 years of data. They surveyed people throughout their lifetimes, multiple generations. They kept track of how everybody in the study did over time. Did they climb the ladder in their career? Did they make money? Did they have good health or bad health? Some of them went to jail. Some of them had real health issues, and they had all these factors and this whole statistical analysis of how to explain self reported levels of life satisfaction, happiness, and describe it as thriving, right? And none of it really matters. Like health, poor health, go to jail, climb the ladder. Like none of it had a real statistical association with people's self reported measure of well being, except for did they have quality relationships in their lives? But at the end of the day, in business or in life, if you go home and you had a bad day, I'm going to bet that 9 out of 10 times it was a relationship issue.
Mhm.
It was a people issue. As leaders, the toughest part of our job by a wide margin are the people issues and the relationship
I
issues.
want to read you a quote. The quote is from Dr. Gabriella Rosen Kellerman. She wrote Tomorrow Mind with Dr. Seligman. And in the book, she said, or they say, technology and innovation has made life move faster and last longer. It has created vast wealth, but it has not made us thrive. And this is the nut that I want to crack. Why? We live so much longer. At the turn of the 20th century, average life expectancy in the US was in the 40s, early 40s. Now it's close to 80. We know we have so much more wealth, but why are we not enjoying this? Why are we not happy? What are your thoughts?
If you survey employees in corporate America and ask them if they're engaged with work, more than half of them will say they're disengaged with work. So there's
So
a crisis.
Sebastian, I did that for 25 years. I had a company that did that. We
Yeah,
sold it to Aon in 2016. I'm well aware of the data. It's
yeah,
unbelievable. About 1 in 8, according to our research, and Gallup might say differently, but about 1 in 8 was fully engaged, like super raring to go.
yeah,
1 in 8. And, big, big percentage were disengaged, like actively disengaged. And even some of those who are disengaged weren't looking to leave. So
yeah.
imagine that. So yeah, I know
It
this space
it's
really well.
it's a big deal, and I'm sure you had plenty of business, and it's a good thing to do to try to address it. And if we go back to Irma, in my experience on the relationship side, it's not necessarily about being nice to everybody at work. It's more about building trust through candor and building mutual respect. Also, being nice is a good thing, to be clear. How you give feedback, how you receive feedback, hugely important part of how people end up being engaged or not in their work. Dr. David Rock is really focused on neuroscience, but also psychology and workplace dynamics. He has this trick where asking for feedback is makes the feedback process way easier. So, Don, if I go to you right now and I say, um, Don, can I give you some feedback? Just hearing that sentence to me, like if someone says this, fight or flight response, I get a shot of adrenaline. I'm like, oh, this is going to be hard. But if we build a culture where we all go out of our way, hey, how did I do here? And we proactively ask it, Dr. Rock's research shows the stress response goes way down. So the simple act of asking for feedback, I explain this in the psychology of leadership, can really help with relationships at work. Um, we just talked about meaning. I think meaning is directly linked to engagement and really setting tasks that are related to long term accomplishment and focusing on the process over the outcomes. It really ties everything we've talked about so far and that I cover in the book into a business environment where there's a crisis of engagement. And I think that's part of why. But by the way, your question was much more general. It's like, why as a society are we not happier since we're wealthier in aggregate? There's wealth disparity for sure, but in aggregate, we're wealthier than we've ever been. Mortality rates are better than they've ever been, although they're kind of dipping down in the US for various reasons. But so as a society, what's happening? And by the way, the data for teenagers is the worst. The teenagers are really struggling.
This is my concern, and it not only the social media, I think, parents of our age now or with kids, the ages of our children, we're probably aware of the challenges that social media will pose for mental health for children, but it's AI companions and the use of AI companions as friends and as coaches that I find deeply disturbing. And there was a study recently that 72% of teenagers have used an AI companion. About half use it more than once a month, and about a third of the users have said that their AI companion is as enjoyable or more enjoyable than friendships with their true human friends. And I find this to be very alarming. I know that's
Yeah.
off topic, but
No, I don't think it is because we're talking about positive psychology. You get a pit in your stomach when you hear this.
and your book is a very human book, which I find to be interesting. So when I think about investments and people who are in that field, I think about how they're trying to leverage technology and take the human out of the decision-making process. But your book is very human, and that's what I find to be very appealing about it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah. So we talked about stress, we talked about relationships, we've talked about positive psychology. And we've talked about goals, and we've also talked about technology. Anything else you want to touch on related to technology and AI in the workplace?
Yeah, on technology, on I think it can bring tremendous gains in productivity, but I think it will be transformational for society. It will be transformational for our minds. We know that social media and phone addiction is real and it's messing up with our dopamine and with our ability to socialize. It's a crisis in my mind for teenagers in this country. So we have to be careful. And that's why I feel talking about positive psychology and going back to the basics where there's plenty of research behind it and framing this in the context of the opportunity and the threat from technology and having the debate. what is technology going to do to IRMA that we were talking about, engagement, relationship, meaning, long-term accomplishment? It is going to give you short-term bursts of positive emotions. You're going to scroll and you're going to get a little hit of dopamine, and you're going to get a like and more likes, but then that's how the addiction occurs. So, how do we find the balance and bring positive psychology to the center of that debate? I think is where we need to go.
And you've talked about PERMA, the P in PERMA being positive emotion, being a sugar rush, right? And I think that if we can equate that to what we might get from social media or from these AI companions, and that have an understanding of, oh, this is not necessarily what's good for me. This is not what is in my long-term interests, then we have the awareness to avoid it.
Yeah, and Don, the sad thing is not everybody's wired the same, and there's a heritable component to your ability to experience positive emotions. Some people they just tend to experience more positive emotions than others, right? All the way to clinical issues with depression. So the IRMA is much more sustainable, and it's about thriving, and it's about long-term goals, and it's about reflecting back over long periods of time of what truly made you thrive in your life. But there's nothing wrong with the positive emotions. We want them day to day. That's what we're after. That's what I like about positive psychology. Is centers you on things that matter, and there's a lot of research behind it. It also helps you set goals, which, if there's one thing we haven't talked about that I would want to mention, Don, is we've talked about goals and how setting goals is important. And you have plenty of people coming on your show talking about the importance of long term goals to align organizations. Um, we want to put a man on the moon as a very tangible goal, and it galvanized the nation. What I found in the literature, which I also cover in the psychology of leadership, is the issue with goal-induced blindness. And that might be one thing I want to leave our listeners with, which is research shows that if you become so obsessed with your goal that you lose sight of everything else that might matter, and that's usually the IRMA part, that's usually engagement, relationships, meaning, because you have a measurable goal you want to reach, goal induced blindness sets in, and it's quite dangerous. I had it early in my career. I wasn't taking care of myself, I was working nonstop. And there's a story in the book about how I almost died. I was just physically exhausted, got an infection, and almost just died from it. So, the most prominent example in the literature and psychology of goal induced blindness is Mount Everest, because this is a little bit crazy when you think about it. But if you want to summit Everest, you have a 4% chance of dying in the process, that's statistically. And so there's goal induced blindness there, where the summit is all that matters and your personal safety comes second. Well, that happens in business too. Companies cheat. You have plenty of scandals you can refer to. And so it's important to think about, when will goal induced blindness set in, and to remain aware of goal induced blindness. And there's plenty of it. I had this experiment I gave at a talk recently. I had almost 1,000 students, one of the biggest talks I've ever given. It was finance students. And I can do the experiment with you and our audience if you want, but I asked the students, here's a jar of gummies. It's a thought experiment. I didn't have actual gummies. There's 100 gummies here, 4 of them are poisoned. How much money would I have to give you for you to eat a gummy? And these are all, no one's in poverty here. These are all, they're doing master's degree. They're going to be successful. They don't fundamentally need extra money. And I went up and up and up in a mountain. When I was over 10 million, I had probably 20% of the room raise their hand.
Hmm.
To me, that's goal induced blindness,
Mhm.
right? Would you eat one for a billion?
Would I? I thought about that because I listened to a podcast with you this morning, and you asked the guest, or you asked the host, would she eat one for a
So you've
billion?
been thinking
I've
about
been
your
thinking about
answer.
it, and I wouldn't for a million. Would I for a billion? I would consider it only because of what I could do with that money. The greater good that I could do with that money. Am I willing to take a 1 in 25 chance of dying, and I could end, or I could, propel so many people's lives forward with this. And we do some work in Kenya with students over there, and it's $1,000 to send a girl to school. That's a lot of girls who could go to
Yeah,
school. So I was putting it through that, but I really love living. I do. But your point is taken. Your point is taken, and yes, I have thought about Everest. I've read, the book Into Thin Air,
yeah,
and
same
how
here.
dangerous, yeah, Krakauer, right? John Krakauer,
Yeah,
how dangerous and how many people were vulnerable because a few selfish people pushed forward only for their glory. And I thought, "Oh, how irresponsible was that?" Now, a question that you might wanna ask is, would I feed one of those gummies to my daughter
oh
for
boy,
$1,000,000? And the answer is absolutely
absolutely
not.
no.
Absolutely not.
I hadn't thought about it that way. By the way, your altruistic take on it is kind of a loophole in that thought
A little bit,
experiment,
yeah,
right?
a little bit, yeah, and I'm 57 also, so I've lived a pretty doggone good life, and I tell people, the average life expectancy throughout human history is about 18 or 20, so the 100 billion people who preceded us. So I feel like I'm on life number 4 right now,
Yeah, yeah,
because, I've had it pretty good now, and I'm also thinking about the next 25 years and how I can not fill my cup, but make the world a better place for the rest of humanity in my little
yeah,
way.
yeah.
I've got you for a couple more minutes, and I wanna share 2 stories with you that might be relevant for this conversation. So I came to a point in my life recently, and as I said, I'm 57. I came to this point, and I started thinking about the currency that I value the most, and it's not money, it's love and kindness. And previously, I didn't think that way. So I think it's a product of age, but it's also a product of getting to a certain financial condition. So money is not, I'm not super wealthy, people who are much, much wealthier, but I have enough. And that's the second story that I wanted to share with you. Do you know the story of Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller? Do you know those names?
Yeah, yes, it's, one of them is an
They're
author.
both
It's in
authors.
Morgan Housel's book. I
Yes, yeah,
love that,
yeah,
and I
okay,
want you
okay,
to
okay.
tell it.
Okay, so Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller are 2 of the most famous 20th century authors. Joseph Heller wrote Catch-22, Kurt Vonnegut wrote Slaughterhouse-Five. They're at a party, and I wanted to share this story with you because you've studied billionaires. They're at a party, and this would be today it would be a billionaire's home. And Kurt Vonnegut asks Joseph Heller, he says, "Hey, Joseph, what do you think about this guy and being at this guy's house? He made more today than you made in all your royalties with Catch 22." And Joseph Heller doesn't skip a beat. He turns to Vonnegut and he says, "I have one thing this man will never have." Vonnegut says, "What's that?" And he said, "Enough." And I thought, "Oh, if we could all recognize the enough that we have, this world would be a much better place." And I think what you are doing with your book is helping people understand what their enough is and that it comes from inside and not from being famous or not from being rich or all this external validation. That's what I take away from our time today.
I love that story, and you know what? It's not it I don't think we're saying either of us is saying that pursuing traditional goals is somehow wrong or that you should give up on being ambitious and
Not at
wanting the
all.
promotion and wanting to make money or wanting to be famous, especially if being famous means like you're doing helps a lot of people. That's not what we're saying at all. We're saying pursue those goals, but remember that what truly matters is going to be found somewhere else.
Absolutely. Well, what final advice do you have for leaders that can help guide them and their people into the unknown? Because I feel like we are going into this great unknown, this compressed century where we're going to feel a century's worth of change in the next 10 years. What advice do you have for them?
I'm going to do it in 3 words. And that's going to be my takeaway. We don't do enough of this as leaders, but when you think about it, it is the number one job of the leader. So the 3 words are think long term. I don't know if is long term one word? Think long term.
I love it. Sebastian, that's a great place to end. Thank you for your time and thank you for being a genius.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoy this, Don. This was awesome.